So, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, welcome to the 4th Belgrade Security Forum, and welcome to the presentation of the Transatlantic Trends Report that the German Marshall Fund of the United States has been doing for the past 13 years. This year, the report will cover also Russia, and we have a section on immigration, which makes it different to the reports that have been issued in the previous years. I am very happy that we have been able to be joined here today by our 4 distinguished panelists. Let me introduce you, His Excellency, the Ambassador of the United States, Mr. Michael Kirby, His Excellency, the Ambassador of the European Union, Mr. Michael Davenport, His Excellency, the Ambassador of Italy, Mr. Giuseppe Manzo, and His Excellency and the Secretary General, of the Regional Cooperation Council with the seat in Sarajevo, and the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of, then Yugoslavia, Mr. Goran Svilanović. The report will be presented by my colleague, the Senior Transatlantic Fellow, Dr. Constanze Stelzenmüller, who sits in our office in Berlin. She's practically the author of the Transatlantic Trends report, we will soon hear from her what is the temperature with regards to the traditional and non-traditional transatlantic relations. Before we go into the report, let me just give you a few of the housekeeping rules. Constanze will present the report. There are about 30 to 35 slides. And after that, we will have 4 of our panelists each give their perspective and their view on the transatlantic relations. And then we will have an open session of about 30 minutes for the questions and answers. For those who would like to tweet, please use the hashtag BelSecForum if you want, and the hashtag TTrends14 if you want your tweet to appear on the panel. And I have forgotten to introduce myself. My name is Gordana Delić, and I basically run the German Marshall Fund office here in Belgrade. And because I was told that we need to hurry because we're late and we don't have too much time, I would like to pass the floor on to my colleague who will present the report. I hope you will enjoy the report.
Thank you very much, Gordana, for this very kind presentation. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here, not just in the presence of GMF's new president and old colleague, Dr. Donfried, but to have these 4 very distinguished commentators waiting to pounce on the data. I'm also grateful, Gordana, that this is my last opportunity to present Transatlantic Trends with my very dear colleagues in Belgrade. I haven't been here for years, and it's lovely to be back. And thank you also for referring to me as the author of the report and not of the data. The data, of course, were collected by TNS Opinion, the survey company who does the surveying work for us. As you will know, the data were published on September 10th. There are copies of this report on your seats. If there aren't, you can either get probably some more from us, or you can find them on the website that you can see on, at the bottom of each slide. The other thing that some of you might be interested in is that we've also done country profiles. They look like this. They're also on our website. We haven't printed them out. But those will give you the country-by-country information for those of you who do more in-depth research. And with that, I am going to move straight to my presentation and put this on. All right, can everybody see? Let me see. The presentation should also go up on those screens, so let's see what happens. No. Can somebody fix that? Can all of you see it? Oh, it's just for tweets. Oh, I get it. I'm sorry. In that case, my mistake. Then I will proceed and hope that all of you can see this here. I'll stand a little bit farther back. And I tend to talk very fast. So if I hit the sound barrier at any point, just wave at me. If anything is unclear about what I'm saying, raise your hand but I would suggest that we would reserve comments for the period of question and answer after the comments by our distinguished panel. With that, let me briefly explain how we do this. A survey is a very, very large enterprise indeed, and our survey is run by a consortium of partners. Our main partner is the Turin-based foundation Compagnia di San Paolo, and our other partners are the Barrow Cadbury Trust for the Immigration Data, the Swedish government, rather Swedish Foreign Ministry, which this year made it possible for us to return to Russia for a second time after 2012, and the Fundación BBVA, which I like to pronounce mainly so I can show off my Spanish, and which enabled us to include Spain. On the methodology, I don't know whether there are any survey freaks among you. I am not going to torture you with details about this. Basically, as I said, TNS Opinion does this for us, has been doing it for us for the last 13 years. They also do the Eurobarometer survey, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. And what they do is they get a randomized selection of 1,000 respondents weighted by age, socioeconomic particulars, etc. Per country in Russia, because of the size of the country, it's 1,500. We conducted the survey, and this is important, between June 2nd and June 26th. So certain events that were important, particularly for our relations with Russia and our views on Ukraine, had not taken place yet, in particular the downing of plane MH17. What else do I have? The countries of the survey were, let me see, I've got to read that to you. I always forget what they are. France, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, Poland, Portugal, Spain, Sweden, Turkey, UK, and the United States, and new this year, Greece, and in there for the second time, Russia. So 13 questions, 13 states in all. And as in every year, we have a mixture of trend questions and new questions. Now, and with that, let me give you a brief overview of what I'm about to show you in 4 chapters. We found that the Europeans want a more independent transatlantic relationship, whereas Americans want one on average that is closer. Opinion of US leadership drops dramatically, particularly in Germany. There is still a divide in Europe, a divide basically on how to come out of the crisis, on how to deal with the economic aspects of the crisis, and that divide is deepest between the North and the South. There is a plurality in the United States that wants a legal status for illegal immigrants. Majority support sanctions against Russia and are willing to risk increased conflicts with Ukraine, and remember this was in June when we asked this question. And finally, the Russians see the US and Europe unfavorably, but are willing to work with the West on some issues. And with that, let me take you to my first chapter. Now, this is to those of you who've been subjected to this briefing before, this is a trend question that we've asked for in every year of our survey. And we ask, how desirable is it that the United States exert strong leadership in world affairs? And that is the EU average that you can see here. And as you can see, there is a bit of a trough in the Bush years, and then there was a jump of nearly 20 percentage points to 55%, and that value has remained nearly stable for all of President Obama's tenure. Conversely, when you ask in America about European leadership, the first thing you have to keep in mind that different political cultures mean different things by leadership. When Americans talk about or think about European leadership, what they mean, I think in most cases, is burden sharing. And what you can see here is a dwindling support for European leadership between 2006 and 2013, and then a jump last year of 13 percentage points, which is interesting, and I think I'll leave that to our panelists perhaps to try and interpret that. I do have some views of my own. Now, let me show you the next slide. This gives you the absolute numbers and desire for leadership and compares them with the values for leadership from Russia and leadership from China. What you can see here, these are the numbers I showed you before for 2014 in June, with 83% of Americans saying we want US leadership. Well, that's as per usual, but 70% saying we want European leadership, and a correspondingly high number in Europe who say we want leadership from the EU, and 56% who want American leadership. And now compare with Russia and China. Very low numbers, only a fourth in the EU of respondents on average who say they want leadership from Russia or China, slightly higher number in the United States. Again, keep in mind that Americans are more likely to think of this as burden sharing. Slightly lower numbers in Turkey, as you can see. Now, here we've been asking, in fact, for the last 13 years, about approval of the US president's foreign policy. These numbers were very, very low during the Bush presidency. They were considerably lower than, in fact, desirability of US leadership values in general. What you can see here is the 2009 numbers, which are extraordinarily high. In fact, they represent an enormous jump from the Bush years of, I don't know, several tens of percent. And nowhere was that jump higher than in Germany, where they jumped to 92%. I wrote an op-ed at the time titled "The Dalai Obama," because I felt that some of these expectations were unrealistic, and it turned out that that was fairly accurate as an expectation. But then when you look at how the numbers have developed since then, particularly between 2013 and 2014, this animation comes to us courtesy of a very intelligent intern in the Washington office. You can see that the numbers have been dropping significantly. And I'll show you now the difference between last year and this year. And as you can see, this is the blue columns represent the difference between 2009 and 2013, and the orange columns, the difference over last year. And there you can see very distinctly how large the drop is in Germany. There's a fairly clear explanation for this, as far as I'm concerned. I live and work in Berlin and have for the last decade. And the NSA revelations have gone down very badly in Germany. Again, you could reflect on this at length, but I won't. And the other thing that has been a matter of some contention is the trade and investment negotiations for the trade and investment agreement, TTIP. Here we asked about countries' own foreign policy. And what you can see here is on general, majority, in average, a majority approval for countries' own foreign policy in the EU. Very high approval ratings in Russia, in Sweden, and in Germany. It's quite rare that these countries are together on anything in the survey. Here they are. Very low numbers in Greece, and as you will see in the course of the rest of the survey, Greece is a bit of an outlier in this survey. The Greeks are unhappy with almost everything. I have some sympathy with that. They've had a very rough time with the economic crisis, possibly the roughest in Europe, and it shows in the numbers. In the US, you have a majority disapproval rating of 58%. But that is still lower than the approval for Obama's foreign policy as you can see here, if you look at these numbers, I'll just give you the EU average. 64% approve of Obama's foreign policy, and then you go back and you have only 52% who approve in the EU on average of their own government's foreign policy. Interesting. So I think what that shows you, perhaps not so much, that's not so much an evaluation of specific foreign policy issues, but it is a reflection of the expectations that Europeans have of America. Now, this is a related question to the desirability question. We simply ask, how favorably do you view X country? So do you have a favorable or unfavorable view of the US, of Europe, of the European Union rather, of Russia or of China? And what you can see here is that you have fairly high numbers in the transatlantic relationship. Those have been quite stable over time, even through crises, but you have very low numbers for Russia and for China. In the EU, only a fourth say they have a favorable opinion of Russia. In America, even less, 20%. Numbers are slightly higher for China. Now, this is a key slide, and it is the slide on which I based my very first key findings point that I talked about at the outset of the survey. Here we ask, as we have been since the beginning of the survey, do you think that the partnership in security and diplomatic affairs between the United States and the European Union should become closer, should remain about the same, or should the European Union, or rather the US, take a more independent approach from the other side? Now, this needs some explanation. What you can see here in the blue columns, those are the numbers of those who say we need a more independent approach. Not a popular position in Poland, not a popular position in the US, but in Greece, 69% say we have to have a more independent approach from America, Italy 58, Spain 58, Germany 57, Portugal, France 51, and an EU average of 50. That's the first time in almost a decade that the EU average became a majority. And the last time was under the Bush administration. Now, that number has jumped significantly over the last year in some countries, and particularly, as you can see, the light blue columns are the values for last year, and you can see the largest jump is in Germany, from 40% last year to 57% this year. So a 17 percentage point increase over 1 year in those who in Germany say we need to have a more independent approach. Now, the good news of this slide, and there is good news in it, but you have to look slightly more closely. If you add together the column values, the green segments, those who say the relationship should become closer, and those who say things are fine just as they are, in other words, they can remain the same, you will see that majorities in this part of the slide say things are fine. So I think the lesson from this slide is that feelings are very mixed across Europe, but they have been deteriorating alarmingly in some parts of Europe, and particularly in my country. Again, I think the same explanation holds that I was referring to earlier. NSA revelation haven't gone down well. I think in Germany there are enormous historical sensitivities, both in the former East and in the former West. Now, I'm going to jump over these and go to the second chapter, the economy, the EU, and immigration. This is a chapter that we started introducing at the beginning of the economic crisis. Transatlantic Trends was from the outset very much a foreign and security policy survey, and there were many, many issues to be discussed. Wars and interventions, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, or at least the possibility of intervention. And as those wound down and as the economic crisis started hitting European countries severely, we decided that we needed to look at this as well, and that we also needed to look at immigration for the simple reason, and I'm sure that this will resonate with anybody who lives and works here in the Balkans and in Belgrade in particular. You know that people's views on how they are situated personally, economically, and how they feel about people moving into or out of their countries has a great deal to do with their preferences about foreign and security policy. In fact, it is a very important limitant on public opinion's willingness to give its representatives leeway in foreign and security policy, hence this chapter. Now, this is the basic question which we start the chapter with, and we ask people very simply, how profoundly have you been affected, or your family, by the economic crisis? And what you can see here is that 95% of our Greek respondents, almost everybody we asked, said, I and my family have been profoundly affected by this crisis. In Portugal, 91%. In Spain, 81%. And the European average is still 57%. These orange values are from 2009, when we first started asking this question. So as you can see, in some cases, the numbers have actually gone up alarmingly, such as in France, from 42% to 64%. What you're not seeing here, though, and that is something that I would caution you about, is that in between some of those numbers were actually higher than they are now. So the micro story of this question is that the numbers have slowly been going down in the last year or two. And as you can see, the Germans and the Swedes over here are living on an island of the blessed, where the numbers have been going down from very benign values anyway 5 years ago. Now, here we asked, generally speaking, do you think that your country's membership in the European Union has been a good or a bad thing for your country? That is a slightly different wording than what we've been using for the last 4 years, when we asked whether this had been good for your economy. And it's possible that by not mentioning the economy, but just the country itself, the values have become slightly more benign. But I am showing you last year's values all the same. And there they are. In general, you can see that you have an average of 65% this year who say that membership in the EU has been good for their country. Obviously, for Turkey, that's a hypothetical question, but even in Turkey, you have 53%. That's a quite significant increase over last year. saying that membership would be good for their country. That is one of several data points in the Turkish data that seem to suggest a return to a slightly warmer attitude towards Europe. I won't say it's cordial, but it's warming up slightly from something that was quite cool for a long time. What's interesting to me is, I mean, these numbers are fairly obvious to all of us. I mean, the Germans have profited from the EU, of course, or as Americans would say, duh. The Poles have as well, as we know, so have the French. What's interesting here is that even 51% of the Brits say that the membership in the EU has been good for their country. That's perhaps slightly less intuitive. Now, here we asked for the first time, why has EU membership been good for your country? Something we haven't done before. We did this last year for the first time with the NATO question, which I'll show you later, where we asked people, why has NATO membership been essential for you? And we gave people a menu of choices. It's a community of democracies, free movement to work, travel, and study. It has maintained peace in Europe. It's strengthened European economies. What you can see here is that clearly the more important option is the fact that it's a community of democracies, which I think is significant. So it is very much, for these respondents, a question of values. Then the free movement of people to work and travel and study. And finally, maintenance of peace. I would have thought, being a German, that this argument would be slightly larger. It is actually, but only in France and Germany, where it's 28% who say that, and that is the second largest group both in Germany and France, where historically, obviously, this argument has held enormous significance. Now, here we asked the ones who said that the EU had been bad for their country, why this was. Now, keep in mind, I'm going to show you this other slide again. Keep in mind that these are the orange segments here. That's a fairly small sample. So a small sliver of a small sample is going to be statistically almost irrelevant. On the other hand, if you look here, these 45%, that's a significant answer. The ones who say that the EU has been bad for their country will, a large plurality say it's been bad for our country's economy. The authority argument, I think, was key in Britain. The culture argument was key in Turkey. Now, here, of course, we asked the corollary question about the euro. And we asked people, do you think that using the euro in your country has been, or in the case of Sweden and the UK, would be a good thing or a bad thing for your country's economy? And what you can see is that there's no chance that the UK or Sweden will be joining the euro anytime soon, despite sort of tiny little movements downwards. The Greeks don't like the euro. The Spanish, not very keen on it. But the numbers have been going down and have been going down quite significantly, for example, in countries like France, from 2/3 to 51%. Germany and the Netherlands are the only two countries in the survey where people say very clearly the euro has been good, where you have majorities saying the euro has been good for our economy. That said, again, the micro story is that the negative numbers have been going down, which I think is a sign of the crisis receding in people's minds. Now, this is a very interesting slide, and it needs some explanation. Here we asked, for the first time, two questions where we tried to find out whom people blame for the continuing impact of the crisis, and whether they blame their own governments or whether they blame the EU or both. So we asked, is the European Union doing enough to combat the economic crisis in Europe? And do you think the countries most severely affected by the economic crisis are doing enough to combat the economic crisis themselves? And you're not going to get these numbers if you just add them together. We cross-tab them. What you can see is the answer in most people's minds, large majorities or pluralities, is both sides are at fault. But there is a smaller story here that you have to look for, which is that there's two countries that feel slightly differently, or where the preferences are much clearer. And that is that in Germany, you have 22% who think it's only the countries where the crisis is most severe who are to blame. And in France, there are 35%, by far the largest group, who think that only the EU is to blame. So that would indicate that with an EU economic commissioner called Mr. Moscovici, there could be interesting times ahead for the future of European economic policy, particularly where Germany is involved. Now, This is a question that will be of interest to those of you here who are diplomats. We asked about how people feel about control over budgets. In other words, how people feel about the EU taking on more authority over budgetary and economic policies in member states, something that has been part of some of the rescue packages and the bailouts. And again, there is widespread disapproval. As you can see, the EU averaged 64%, but also the story that you really want to watch here is that the numbers have been going down. High disapproval in Greece. Of course, the Greece have basically almost been put on under complete EU authority, but in Germany also 60% disapproval. Now, this is a new question that we thought we needed to finally ask, and it is what to do about Britain. The question that we asked specifically was, as you may know, the UK has raised concerns about the terms of its membership in the EU, and there has been some discussion of the UK leaving the European Union. Do you think other EU member states should do more to accommodate the UK, or should the UK just leave? And what you can see is that all of us feel 51%, or a majority of 51% feel that the UK should somehow be accommodated, except the French, where 52% feel, it's too bad we don't have the French ambassador on the panel, 52% feel that the UK should just leave rather than be accommodated. But what's really interesting about this slide, in my view, is that 57% of the British respondents would rather like to be accommodated as well. In other words, I think that there is room for compromise here. And I think that 57% of the British respondents would be very happy to see that happen. And with that, I'm going to show you a couple of slides on immigration, because that is another key indicator of how people feel about a more forward-leaning foreign and security policy. What you can see here is that 60% of our respondents in Europe, on average, say that they are unhappy with the government's handling of immigration. Now, this is a question that is that I should perhaps put into context a little bit. Like the one I showed you at the beginning of this chapter about how affected people are, this is a question that asks, in the most general terms, how people feel about a certain policy field. And they will usually give you a very simple gut reaction to that. That gut reaction is important to measure because it is a measure of people's sensitivity to populist politics. And therefore it's important to take seriously. But what we have found, both with the economic questions and with the immigration questions, that as soon as you start asking people about very specific policy issues, and I'm going to show you that on immigration in a moment, you will get responses that are far more rational than some of the populist discourse would have you believe. So let me take you to some of those. Here we asked, very simply, what we think motivates immigrants. We asked them, do you think immigrants come to work to seek social benefits? This is hardly readable, so I'll read it to you. Seek asylum, to be united with family members, to study, or none of the above, or other, don't know. And what you can see is that most respondents, a plurality in the EU and the US, say they come to work. Yeah? Then, however, the second largest group, particularly if you add together seek social benefits and seek asylum, the second and third largest groups say they come and are burdens on the state. That again is an entryway, I think, for populist discourse. And in Turkey, of course, you have a 60% group who say they come to seek asylum, which in this case is a perfectly rational response because it corresponds with social reality. As you know, the Turkish state and Turkish society have very generously taken in enormous numbers of Syrian refugees, which are by now proving a serious burden on the Turkish economy and Turkish society. Finally, this is a question for the Americans. We asked about illegal immigrants, a very serious issue in America. As you know, Obama's government has just postponed a policy decision on illegal immigration until after the midterm elections. We asked people, do you think that illegal immigrants should be given a path to gain legal status? Should they just be repatriated? And they were given the options to say, well, it depends on the circumstances. A quarter said it depends, a quarter said repatriate, and a clear plurality of 45% they should be given some kind of legal status. And when you ask those 45%, should that include a path to citizenship, you get an even clearer response. 86% say yes. Again, I think that's a good example of people's preferences being slightly more rational than you would think if you just turned on Fox News. Sorry. Now, moving swiftly on to the security chapter. And here we start with the NATO question that I referenced earlier. We asked quite simply, some people say that NATO is still essential to our country's security, others say it is no longer essential. Which of these views is closer to your own? And what you can see here is the US and the EU numbers in a snake-like embrace, ever over 13 years, with fairly solid majorities saying it's still essential. What's interesting in comparison is the Turkish numbers, which took a nosedive after 2003, after the Bush administration's attempt to persuade the Turks to let them invade Iraq through Turkey. That didn't work, as we know, and things went swiftly downhill from there, moved slightly upwards in recent years, and have taken a 10% percentage point rebound last year. Be interesting to have our colleague from Ankara reflect on that if he wants to. Now, here is where it gets interesting in terms of current affairs. We asked ahead of the Welsh summit what missions should NATO be engaging in the future, and gave people 4 choices, one of which we split. Let me explain those. We asked, should it be engaging in territorial defense of Europe? And you can see a solid majority in the US and 3/4 in Europe saying yes, it should. In Germany, interestingly, that was even higher, 76%. In Turkey, 57%. And remember, that was only in June. I would guess that those numbers would be even higher now. Second option, military operations outside of the US and Europe. A plurality in the US, 49%, 43% a minority, but a large one in the EU, and in Turkey, 41%. Then we suggested, what about attempting to establish stability in places like Afghanistan? Interestingly, despite people's reservations about this, the numbers here for the Afghanistan options, when you mention Afghanistan, jump a little higher. You've got a majority of 53% in the US, 57% in the EU. The numbers across the countries surveyed were quite different from that. They were quite low in Germany, but very, very high in Poland, and 43% in Turkey. Now, this last one, the 4th one, is one where we asked half the survey respondents, in other words, 500 in every country, providing arms and training, and then for the other half that we asked, we mentioned countries like Ukraine to see whether that would make a difference. And what you can see here is that basically it didn't. Americans in a majority are willing to provide arms or training. What America's former Secretary of Defense, Bob Gates, referred to as helping other people help themselves. In the EU, you have a minority, but a fairly large one, agreeing, and in Turkey, only 38 or 36%. Now, here's the question that I mentioned at the outset in my key findings. We asked, should the European Union, or the US, continue to provide economic and political support to Ukraine, even if there is a risk of increasing conflict with Russia? And we asked very deliberately, even if there is a risk of increasing conflict with Russia, and of course we asked that question the other way around in Russia as well. And what you can see here is that 58% in Europe, a solid majority, say yes. In Sweden, 73%. In Poland, 67%. And I must say, to my not inconsiderable surprise, in Germany, 65% or 2/3 as well. The numbers are very low in Greece and Turkey, where you have majorities, and in Spain as well, where you had majorities disagreeing. But everywhere else in Europe and the US, you have majorities saying, yes, we have to stick it out. Now, the obvious follow-on question was, well, what should we be doing to help Ukraine? And again, this is a new question. So I don't have historical data for that, but what we asked about was economic aid. And this is something people have no problem with across the board. We asked about sanctions against Russia, where the numbers, even in June, were, to my mind, astonishingly high. In Poland, this is just to show you some of the highest numbers in the survey, 77%. But in the EU, 61%. In the US, 64%. The Germans at the time were split 49 to 49%. But if you look at more recent surveys in Germany, the numbers for Germany on sanctions have gone up as well. Finally, provide military supplies and equipment to Ukraine. In the US, 43%. In Poland, 52%. That was the only country that had a majority for that. And the EU, no great sympathy for that. What I think is really remarkable about this set of questions is how many people were willing to offer EU and NATO membership. As you can see, 68% of Americans were willing to offer NATO membership. Of course, we didn't ask them about the EU. 46% of Europeans, a large majority, said let's offer them NATO membership, and 2/3 of the polls. And 52% of Europeans in general said they were willing to offer Ukraine EU membership at the end of the line, and 69% of polls. That brings me to my very last chapter, a short series of slides about Russia from the Russian data, and then I will be done with this. Here we asked Russians what they worry most about, and unsurprisingly, they worry most about the economy and about international instability and corruption. Most Europeans worry about unemployment or about the economy, much less about instability and corruption. This is the Russian version of the question I showed you earlier. This is about Russia's relationship with NATO. Do you think that the partnership in security and diplomatic affairs between Russia and NATO should become closer, remain about the same, or should Russia take a more independent approach? And it compares the data between 2012 and 2014. And as you can see, the numbers for more independent approach have gone up, but they haven't gone up that much. 36% 2 years ago, and 47%, a plurality now, say a more independent approach. But a full third say things should stay about the same, which is tantamount to saying let's not throw the NATO-Russia Act overboard, which I find quite remarkable. Finally, we asked Russians, of course, about favorability of the countries in their neighborhood. And as you can see, they feel strongly about Belarus, about Moldova. Georgia, they already have mixed feelings, and they have quite unfavorable feelings about Ukraine. 64% say we have unfavorable feelings there. Finally, this is the question that I mentioned to you where we asked the Russians. The mirror image question about what to do about what were they willing to risk for the conflict in Ukraine. And the question was, do you think Russia should act to maintain its influence over Ukraine, even if there is a risk that could cause conflict with the EU? We didn't ask about NATO, we asked about the EU. And 53% say maintain influence, 29%, which I find remarkable, say let's not risk that. And finally, two last slides where we ask the Russians whom they should work with. This one is based on a question that we've often asked in Turkey. Whom should Russia work with? 36% say let's work with emerging powers like India and China. 29% say the CIS states, the states of the former Soviet Union. Finally, 14% with the EU countries. 10% Russia should act on its own. I suppose that in its own strange way is good news. But only 2% willing to work with the United States. Now, finally, here we asked the Russian respondents about two fields where Russia has traditionally cooperated constructively and very pragmatically with the West. One being the negotiations with Iran over their nuclear program, and the other one being the war in Syria. And what you can see here is that you have almost equal values for Syria and for Iran. You've got a third in each case, roundabout, saying let's work with the EU and the US, and an equal number saying let's work alone. So people are divided on that, but they're not divided on the eastern neighborhood. There you have a very clear plurality of 36% saying we'll do this on our own, thank you very much, and not work with America and the EU. And that, I think, I will jump over that and come to my conclusion. And that gives you a run-through through this year's data. I haven't showed you all the data, nor have I showed you all the questions. For those in particular who are interested, say, in Iran or in immigration, there are more in the survey. You will also, by the way, find the data themselves, should you be interested, on that website. But let me summarize for you again. There is a slight mismatch in the transatlantic relationship between a lot of Europeans who want a more independent relationship and Americans who want a closer relationship. But I do want to qualify that by noting that on issues that are very close to our hearts and that we feel very strongly about, such as Ukraine, there appears to be a great deal of overlap in what we think are useful and desirable policy options. And if you look at the numbers on leadership and on favorability, the relationship looks quite healthy to me. That said, the US-German relationship needs some work, clearly. And the divide in Europe, while it appears to be narrowing down a little bit as the crisis recedes in parts of Europe, it is still not something that we can afford to ignore. There's a real north-south divide, and it is not making coming to policy agreement within Europe on Ukraine and what to do there, and on what could be a new east-west divide any easier. So it's something that we must take very seriously. Finally, immigration, a good bellwether for people's feelings about foreign and security policy, and something that people are often concerned about. But then strong feelings about Western policy towards Ukraine, towards keeping Ukraine on its westward path, and through economic and political support, and even through sanctions, and even in risking increased conflict with Russia. And finally, a Russian public which has very unfavorable views of the US and the EU, which I have to say is reciprocated, but I think is a lot more, on the average, a lot more responsive to the notion that one should cooperate on some issues than some of the leadership appears to be, at least in its official rhetoric. And with that, I'm going to say thank you very much for your patience. If you have any questions, I'm going to be sitting on the panel to answer them, but I think we'll hand over now to our distinguished respondents. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Constanze. Oops. Sorry. While it is very reassuring that the transatlantic relationship looks very healthy, I think it's undoubtful that it's also being challenged in many different ways. I'd like now to turn to our panelists and basically ask them to comment on the transatlantic relationships from their point of view. And also I would like to ask them to touch on the fact that we are in Serbia, in Western Balkans, and what the current transatlantic relationship mean for this region, or in particular for Serbia, and what's in it for Serbia. So Ambassador Kirby, if I may kindly ask you to comment on the report that we've just heard, if there's anything that struck you, and if you could perhaps touch on what's in it for Serbia and where should Serbia be in the current transatlantic relationship.
Thank you very much. Constanze, was an interesting report, and I wonder what might have happened if the data was collected more recently. There certainly have been a number of events since the data was collected that could well, as you mentioned, from the downing of MH17, had an impact on people's views. I would say that I find the slide that shows the sort of view of the relationship as sort of about the same on both sides of the Atlantic interesting, and also quite interesting to see what's happened with Turkey recently. You know, Serbia finds itself in an interesting place at this time, which is one of the fun things about my job here. And for you weren't around to witness some of the back and forth I had with the Russian ambassador, but it seems that the relationship in Serbia with us isn't as perfect as, or is as imperfect as it is elsewhere. In any event, I would like to turn to Victoria Nuland, and not just because she's Assistant Secretary, but you touched on an issue that we have with Germany and perhaps the NSA issues. I do believe that Toria was recorded saying some things about the EU relationship, and it was played back, which might suggest that recordings are common in some places. But she was NATO ambassador and really has had some time to look at this thing. And when she took a look at the data, she was saying Europeans perceive EU membership as a good thing because of the role the EU plays as a community of democracies. For decades, the appeal of EU enlargement has helped young democracies transform, promoting principles such as media freedom, minority rights, rule of law, strong public institutions, and open spaces for civil society to flourish. It's as important today as it ever has been for us to protect all of these things, including our own space. And I really think that those thoughts are applicable here in Serbia. These are, for those of us who are here taking a look at what I hope is continued movement towards EU membership. These are all things that Toria mentioned that are tremendously important for Serbian society. In the days 15 years ago and before, there was a notion that the order that you had to go through was to join NATO and then to join the EU. And NATO stood and stands for a lot of those same things. I would argue that that's not necessarily an order that one has to go through, but that if you're talking about bringing things to Serbia, I think what you've seen here is the kinds of things that would be good for Serbia, and I think there's a growing realization in Serbia that these are good. I would note that Michael Davenport and I and some of the members of this audience on Sunday took a stroll in downtown Belgrade. And yes, there were a lot of police, but my impression was that there was a lot less, there was a lot more tolerance than we had come to expect from past times. So I think some of these EU aspirations, these EU things, and what NATO stands for, is taking deep root here. But I also think that, you know, we, both the United States and our NATO partners, have to tend our own gardens. We have to make sure that we keep this alliance alive. I think, you know, historically it was about protecting Europe, and it seems from your slides that there's a very deep feeling every place in Europe that that's continuing to be valid, and perhaps given the events of this year, even more valid. You know, one of the other issues that's not there, you talked about immigration, but energy, and energy is a key issue. It's been an issue for a long time. I remember in the 70s, early 70s, waiting in gas lines in the United States. And we certainly have had energy as a hugely important issue in the United States for a long time. I think a variety of events, including a couple winters ago when gas didn't flow so well, climate change, all of these issues have gotten people, or should be getting people, to think carefully about energy sources and the nature of energy markets, because I would argue that those are hugely important in the security context. Hugely important to my country, hugely important to Serbia, which is perhaps at greater risk than some others that have more energy opportunities. But I would also note that both NATO and the EU stand very much for fighting corruption. I would note that your slide where you talked about Russia and corruption being an issue, and for much of the EU, corruption not being an issue. Frankly, it's a significant issue here in Serbia, and the kinds of reform that we talk about when we talk about having joined NATO, qualified to join NATO, and certainly what I'm seeing as an American watching what the EU's interested in doing here in Serbia is also getting rid of that corruption. It's no secret that the corruption in Ukraine was hugely damaging to that society and led to some of the events that we've seen play out. I'd like to note in the leading up to Wales, President Obama visited Tallinn and made very clear that NATO for the United States is viable, is real, and we understand the commitments that we've made to our European partners. I think that that was unequivocal. I would note, as Obama said, we're stronger because we're democracies. We're not afraid of free and fair elections because true legitimacy can come only from one source, the people. We're not afraid of an independent judiciary because no one is above the law. We're not afraid of a free press or vibrant debate or a strong civil society because leaders must be held accountable. We're not afraid to let our young people go online to learn and discover and organize because we all know that countries are more successful when their citizens are free to think. I think these are the kinds of reforms that Serbia is moving towards. If you take a look at this calendar year, January 21st, hugely important. As Serbia started the accession process. March, you had elections here. It's quite possible that you'll have 4 years of space to make a lot of the difficult changes that will be necessary. But that wouldn't have been possible with a date last year in April, where there was some courage by the government to reach an agreement with Kosovo and move forward. I would also note, in terms of military cooperation, in Serbia, in July, Serbia hosted a Platinum Wolf, which was an exercise that brought together military folks from Azerbaijan, Bulgaria, Croatia, Macedonia, Romania, Serbia, and the United States. And it took place at South Base, and it's an effort to build on peacekeeping. I'm hugely encouraged by what I've seen in the past couple of years that I've been here, as Serbia has contributed more and more to international peacekeeping, where I think Serbia is shifting from being a stability importer to, one hopes, a stability exporter. In that regard, I was pleased to see Minister Gasić in Wales, and I was also pleased. Last week, I got a letter from Prime Minister Vučić to my president, committing Serbia to be part of the international fight against ISIL. President Nikolić and Foreign Minister Dacic said the same thing in New York at the UN. Serbia is starting to contribute in many serious ways to stability. They've again said that they're aware, as we all are, about a threat from outside the region, Ebola, that people haven't mentioned, but there are a variety of other threats, and Serbia isn't quite sure how it can help, but it says it would like to help. We have Serbia joining the international community in a very positive way. So it's a time of opportunity. Particularly, I would note that many of us look forward to Serbia's chairmanship of the OSCE next year. It's not going to be easy. That's, I guess, an understatement. But it's a huge opportunity. I think, when we look back 10 or 15 years ago, you had data starting back in 2002. I think in 2002, if you had asked how many people think that Serbia will one day be chairman of the OSCE, you would have had sort of the 2% response. But this is an opportunity for Serbia. So I think Serbia is engaging. I hope to see Serbia in the EU one day. It's an open question about NATO. I think if Serbia were interested in joining NATO, and if Serbia could make a very positive contribution to NATO, then NATO would be willing to discuss that. But I think Serbia can join the EU, move forward, work with the world on peacekeeping through the EU, through the UN and other places in a very positive way. So I think I would close by, I would note that Serbia in some ways may have certain things more in common with Greece on some of the statistics, would be my guess, than than maybe with Poland. But you know, you can see change, and I think it's been very positive change that's coming here. So thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Kirby. It's actually very nice, especially for me. I mean, I'm a citizen of this country, and it's very nice to be reminded of good things that have taken place in the past year. I tend often to forget about that or take them for granted, and it's actually really very nice to be reminded of that. I also thank you for saying that you would like to see Serbia in the family of European nations, and that brings us then to Ambassador Davenport to comment on the current report, to comment maybe on what's going on in the European Union. It has been going through some really turbulent times recently. The further enlargement is in question, obviously, and yet we all hope it will happen. Where do you see Serbia should put its main focus in the coming period? What do you think Serbia should be doing better? And help us understand how we can help Europe help us to get where we would like to get.
Thank you, Gordana. And thank you also, Constanze, for your really not just clear but entertaining presentation of the figures and the statistics. I realized yesterday evening that I was going to be constrained in my remarks today because I watched the link of your presentation in Brussels where Giuseppe's current boss and my future boss was commenting in the same way on all of this. But actually, I think her remarks stimulated, you know, further thoughts. I'll come on to the particular points that you raised a bit later, if I may. Certain key things struck me from studying these figures, and of course, without the benefit of the huge familiarity with previous years' results that others, of course, have. One thing that struck me very forcibly, and you brought this out, is the very steady historical support in the EU for US leadership and in the US for EU leadership. I'm not sure whether there is a semantic difference between the European understanding of leadership and the US understanding of leadership, whether leadership really means something else, namely burden sharing. But I think what that said to me was that there really is, you know, quite a strong common understanding of what this relationship is about, which I think is in many ways quite encouraging. I was also equally struck by the fact that both the respondents in the US and, on the whole, the respondents in the EU were similarly suspicious of the idea of strong Chinese leadership or strong Russian leadership. Again, something very clearly in common there between the respondents in both places. I was very struck by the fact that the answers from respondents in Greece were really quite different. As you said, I think, although other countries have been also affected by the economic crisis, the answers from Greece were on key issues very different. On NATO, for example, 52% saw NATO as no longer essential for security. But paradoxically, the figures on readiness to offer NATO membership to Ukraine were similar in Greece to other NATO countries, and also the readiness to offer EU membership to Ukraine was similar in Greece as in other EU countries. Also, I thought very striking were some of the figures from your Russia inquiry. I think what was particularly striking was, that Russia, the respondents from Russia, admittedly 1,500 of them, that they were unique in their confidence in their country's leadership. They were unique in the extent of their confidence in the policies, especially the foreign policies of their leadership. The figures were considerably higher. Nobody else no other country was above 80. And also, I think, possibly no surprise, and again, it would be interesting, as Michael said, to see the figures after what's happened since June, but it's very striking to see the disapproval when it came to both the EU and the US. I think it was striking also to see the continuing and perhaps growing in some cases conviction in most NATO countries when it comes to the important role for NATO in providing security, especially in the NATO area. And this is interesting, I think, because if we think about NATO over the last 2 decades, this has been all over the place, and NATO itself has been at times very much thrashing around for a role, particularly in the 90s. Interesting now to see that sort of recognition of NATO having a role in these countries' security being recognised. I read into the returns on Ukraine a readiness to contemplate further enlargement as well. And this comes back to Gordana's question. There wasn't a question about enlargement to take in the countries of this part of the world. Maybe in a future iteration. But there was a question about this for NATO. And it's very interesting, I think, that there is that readiness across the board, including from Greece, including from UK, to contemplate enlargement, to include Ukraine. And I think that says something to us. I'm not quite sure what, but it says something to us about the attitudes in EU countries when it comes to enlargement, and perhaps gives the lie a bit to the sort of assumption that there is this overwhelming fatigue about enlargement. I thought there were some other particular things that I can't help but bring out, although we don't have the British or the French ambassador here, that the UK figure on strong EU leadership. I mean, it's very interesting to see 62% saying they want to see strong EU leadership. Maybe leadership now means something else as well in Britain, I don't know, but I thought that was very interesting. And quite interesting that we should not lose sight of I think there's a message, and this is probably not a new iteration, but from Turkey, the relatively unfavourable view of the United States, less unfavourable than of one or two other, than of Russia and China, I would say, I think the figure was about 40, so what you call a plurality for the EU, which needs to inform the approach to Turkey, which plays obviously a key role. I think the slides on the Middle East were also very important, and on partnerships when it comes to dealing with policies and pursuing policies in that part of the world. The results from EU respondents showed that actually 85% in total were looking at the EU doing more on its own, or that we should rely on the EU to do things in the Middle East. I'm not quite sure what people mean when they say that, but the fact that only 10% thought that they should rely on the US also must, again, it's often difficult to know precisely what this message this is sending, but it sends some sort of a message about how the US is perceived as playing a role, and maybe needs to be followed up in some way. Interestingly, you didn't ask the question. I think this is a point that Federica Mogherini made, actually, that you didn't ask the question about other regional powers that the EU should be thinking about working with, or should be working with, such as Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, etc. I think very interesting that for Russian respondents, in terms of partnerships of choice, are looking primarily at the BRICS partners, and China, and also at CIS partners, and less at the EU. When it comes to your points about, and I think it would be extremely interesting. It'd be fascinating to see what the answers here would be to these same sets of questions. Would indeed the answers be closer to Greece, or closer to I don't know, Central European countries? Where would Serbia position itself? And I wouldn't presume to guess. I mean, I think this is very, very hard to predict. Of course, we see polls being carried out here on Serbian views of Europe, of EU membership, and the figures vary from time to time. But this, I think, these very same questions put to a cross-section here on the same professional basis would be very, 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 very interesting. I think I would say that the commitment is very much there, and is going to be reaffirmed, I think, in the enlargement strategy, which will appear on the 8th of October, to enlargement, which takes in all the countries of this region, including Serbia. And I think it's also important that Serbia has made its choice. Serbia has made a strategic choice, has started negotiations with the European Union in January this year, and is following through with that in a very, actually in a very systematic way. The negotiations are underway. Not a day has been lost in the accession process, despite the fact that there have been elections. I think there is no question but that will have to be pursued with no ambiguity, because I think that has been the key in previous accession processes. Turning to the views in the EU, I think it's very interesting to see the positive view of the EU growing. This seemed to me to be a clear dynamic that came out of the slides, and not one that I had necessarily expected before when I first started looking at this. And I think very interesting to see that the biggest group giving their reasons for the EU being beneficial is putting community of democracies. And I think that's incredibly important also for us here talking about Serbia acceding to the European Union, because it stresses that it is about those democratic values primarily, that it is those things that citizens of the European Union, and at least the respondents in this survey, show that they value most. Of course, there are the other things too, which you listed, but it's very interesting to me that comes first. I think other points that came out, the other thing that came out to me that I would like just to mention, because I think it's important, is the finding of your survey that there is a willingness to risk conflict in most of the countries that you surveyed, whether it's Russia or whether it's the United States or whether it's in the European Union. I'm not sure that I know quite what that means either, because I'm not sure that I know what people understood by conflict. I noticed that when you delve a little deeper, in fact, there is a readiness to take measures which would be less likely to provoke armed conflict, but which may be more likely to provoke conflict of some other kind. So I think it's, one could delve even deeper, probably. But I think that's also very interesting. So my final message is let's encourage you to ask the same questions here. I think you should do it in Serbia because I think that would be extremely interesting.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Davenport. So the leadership that you have mentioned definitely is something that also Serbia, I believe, will need to continue strengthening on its path towards the European Union, and will definitely need to continue working on improving and further improving the skills if we want to join the family of the European nations. That brings us to the upcoming Italian presidency and its leadership of the European Union. And also, Ambassador Kirby mentioned that Serbia will soon also preside over the OSCE. I'd like to ask you to reflect in general on the report, but if you could also reflect on the Italian presidency and what are the plans maybe towards the perhaps the Western Balkan region in general, or maybe towards Serbia, and what will maybe the Serbian presidency over the OSCE mean for the Italian presidency over the EU?
Thank you, Gordana, and thank you, Constanze, for a very, very accurate and interesting presentation. I'm a bit disappointed because when I got a call from Sonia, she asked me to join the panel. I was very happy. I said, okay, yes, they realized, they acknowledged that my transatlantic career, because out of the 22 years of my diplomatic career, I spent 11 years on the other side of the Atlantic. So half in the US, between New York and Washington, and half in Europe. Interestingly enough, out of these 10 years in Europe, half were this side of the Adriatic, that is Albania and Serbia, and half that side, that's my country actually, Rome. So I do speak transatlantic, I do speak transadriatic, but you call me to talk about the Italian presidency. That's fine, okay. I'll be happy to do that. No, I'm kidding. So I think I can give a bit of a contribution on that, because I think what I just heard about the key findings, it's quite important also for the Italian presidency. It's actually currently going on since July, and hopefully, let's say, going on well and finishing by the end of December. So their findings and the survey was conducted in June. I understand, throughout June. So this is luckily enough for me, because the program of the European Union, the Italian presidency of the European Union, was already printed by then, because otherwise someone would perhaps doubt or imply that we spied on our German Marshall Fund friends or peeked to the results, because many of the issues that are raised there are addressed in our program that's going on. So I took some notes during the presentation, and I have some numbers I think that I took down that will help me tell you why this is true, and why the Italian presence of the European Union matters in links with the German Marshall Fund findings. So, if the numbers are correct, and I assume they are, if you take 200 individuals, 100 from one side of the ocean, 100 from the other side, 143 of them, of the 200, are asking the same thing from both sides of the ocean. They're asking for more Europe. Is that true? 73 from our side and 70% from the US side. So they're asking for both a more, let's say, a strong role of Europe on foreign policy, so be it particularly in the neighboring regions of Middle East, Mediterranean, of course, Eastern neighborhood, and the same number of people are asking for more Europe on economy, and particularly, and I read, employment and growth. So this is, I think, the political point that I would like to raise here. There is a recurring number on this side of the Atlantic, and this is 73. 73% of European citizens are asking for Europe to have a stronger leadership in the world. Actually, 77% in Italy and 87% in Germany. They're asking for more, the strong leadership in the EU, of the EU in the world. And the same number, 73% of Europeans believe EU should do more on economy. This is quite remarkable. And for Italians, the single most important issue is unemployment. So, I mean, this is remarkable. And let me just add something, because Constanze quite rightly stressed this point. Immigration, it's one more issue on which you find remarkable numbers, unfortunately, on the negative side, on how the governments are handling the issue. But again, immigration also raised a lot of attention in Europe. But why am I singling out these numbers? Why am I raising these issues? For two reasons. And then this goes back to why I'm here as let's say, Presidency in Office of the European Union. First, because all the issues I mentioned and the numbers are things that are perceived as close to US citizens. I mean, citizens do care about these issues. So being safe, so a strong leadership in the world, have a healthy economy, of course, and immigration. So this is one point. And the other point, and this is my theory I'm presenting here, is that they matters to me and to us because they are exactly the point that make the strategy of the Italian presidency of the European Union, what it is now. So they are all priorities from the program of the Italian presidency of the European Union. And I'm not going through the booklet here, but this is the program. And just to quote, point number one of the framework is a job-friendly Europe delivering economic growth. Point two is moving Europe closer to its citizens. So point three is taking Europe's foreign policy to a higher gear. So no, we didn't spy on German Marshall funds, but yes, we really got what European citizens and what Europe is now asking to us. So what's the political point I'm making here? Is that obviously we all know what we're talking about, since we're talking about trends, transatlantic trends. The trend is easy to understand. World War II, after that European community and European Union later was tasked with a clear mandate: peace, democracy, freedom. And if you go through the charts here, you'll see that, as Michael was saying, those are the reasons why European citizens like Europe. They do like it because they got from Europe, and so they think that this is beneficial for them. They got peace, they got freedom, and so this is what they asked for. Now it's a different world. So, and people, the citizens, are, now that Europe generally, I think we can agree on this, achieved generally the goals of freedom of movement, freedom of trade, of course, democracy and peace. Now the citizens of Europe are asking for something different, for something more. So more Europe. So, and of course, they ask Europe to be able to address and do it effectively, to address today's challenges, today's needs, and tomorrow's needs, so economy. Either we build this Europe that they're asking us to give them, or Transatlantic Trends number 14, 15, 16 will perhaps send us, let's say, a message saying that Europeans like less and less Europe. So that's the political point that we should discuss. Since we're talking about numbers, and I'm about to finish here, I think that the whole thing I'm trying to offer you as a contribution can be summed up in two numbers. There is actually a spread, a gap. Spread is a word that we all know in financial market, but a spread between that needs to be urgently addressed. There is a spread between the 65, and I'm quoting the charts, 65 of EU citizens that see EU membership as beneficial for their country. So 65% thinks, yes, we benefit from being members of the EU. And then 73% is asking for more Europe. So that's a gap there that we need to, a demand that is coming from Europe that we need, from the citizen, that we need to address. And we, as Italy, as the presidency, so back to my hat of the current president of the European Union Council, and we are trying to address that through our program. And I'm not going through again through the program, but I would just mention a political point that I think it's important as let's say a way forward. In Italy, during the last European Parliament elections, those who have run a campaign based on a pro-European platform got the most of the votes. So they showed that this demand that is coming from the citizens can be turned in support rather than anti-European sentiment. So I think this is encouraging, and this leads me to Serbia that I haven't mentioned in my brief remarks, because I think I didn't need to mention Serbia, because from Serbia too the demand is coming to us. We need to address the demand coming from Serbia for more Europe, as we need to do it with Europe itself. So this is why Italy is a strong supporter of the enlargement, of course, when it comes to Serbia first and the Western Balkans, because we know that the European project will be accomplished only when all Europe will be Europe. So the Western Balkans will be part of Europe. So we have to encourage Serbia to continue on its path. And Michael, the other Michael, mentioned that the Pride Parade was quite a remarkable achievement and a step forward. So we have to encourage Serbia to do this step forward. On the other side, we have to encourage them and to give them concrete signals that the negotiations part is going ahead, because only with this we can address the demand that's coming from Serbia as well. And I wish that next year, as Michael was saying before, that all Serbia will be included in the survey, so that so that enlargement is not only a goal of the Italian presidency, but is also a goal of German Marshall Fund to enlarge the survey to Serbia. Thank you. Grazie.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Manzo. I mean, your words and your final and closing remarks are definitely reassuring that there is a light at the end of the tunnel for us here.
The light is here. We're not in a tunnel, if I may. Because now, if I may, Europe is perceived like something like a long, painful path to something good. It's already good. You know, ask your... no.
I will not argue with you.
No, I'm sorry. Ask your 1,450-something students that are joining the Erasmus program. Ask all the European companies that are working here. We are by far the biggest trade partner and foreign investors. So we are already... It's not the light at the end of the tunnel. It's the light in the tunnel.
So it's not as bad as we think it is. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying that it's much better than what you think it is.
Thank you. Ambassador Svilanović, given where you are currently in Sarajevo, and given that we are already in a much better situation than we think we are, and although, for example, most of the youth population in Bosnia do see themselves outside the borders of their own country, and given the unemployment that is pressing this region, and in the light of the transatlantic relations, what would your message to all of us here be? What would your remarks on the, in general, on transatlantic relationship be? And then with a closer look at this region from the position that you're currently holding.
Thank you very much, Gordana, ambassadors, dear friends to the Belgrade Security Forum, as well as friends of the German Marshall Fund. Thank you very much also for the Balkan Trust for Democracy for the invitation. The mission of the Regional Cooperation Council says in one sentence that we are there to facilitate regional cooperation in order to assist the countries' bid to join EU and NATO, if they wish so. So simple as that. This is what the RCC is about, really just to try to intensify the regional cooperation to support each and every country on their own path towards EU, and if they wish so, of course, NATO. Therefore, all of these issues and the tendencies, trends in transatlantic relations are reflecting in each and every country in this region, particularly at the times we are living in these days when there is a huge tension over Ukraine, and all of these issues are somehow around us. I'm trying to understand some of the findings and would like actually to somehow be less diplomatic in my personal interpretation, which of course might prove to be completely wrong. But look, if someone is offering EU membership or a NATO membership to Ukraine, and at the same time, that one, as a citizen of the EU, is very much in favor of less of the EU influence over domestic issues, particularly economy or budget, for me is a proof of a certain level of detachment of the EU citizens when it comes to both EU and NATO. Only if you have not really interiorized that you are the EU, you can just like this offer to somebody in times of crisis, believing that then it will be somebody else taking care, Americans meaning NATO, or EU meaning Brussels, but not me, not my government, not my country. So I hope I'm wrong, but this is how I read these answers by the very same people. That they believe it's somebody else who is going to take care if we say, oh, let's give them the NATO membership, and then somebody will do it, not my government. this is for me a kind of a contradiction that I'm trying to understand only, and it is very interesting. And I believe that to a huge extent, the findings you've just presented, thank you very much, Constanze, to you and the colleagues who did this, is really reflecting the tensions we've seen over Ukraine, but also is reflecting a deep and devastated results of the economic crisis in each and every country around us. So I would say that we should not just like that neglect to what extent we are all affected by the crisis, and the people who you've been approaching while asking all of these questions. The crisis is hitting very hard each and every citizen of the wider Europe, not only Europeans in terms of members of the EU, this region as well. Therefore, I would really like to join you, Ambassador Manzo, in what you were saying. It is the EU membership at this point which is somehow providing for the countries in the region a safe haven when it comes to dealing with outstanding issues there are. There are security challenges within the region, and there are security challenges which are coming, so to say, from outside the region and are reflected here. And some have been mentioned. Corruption, economic crisis, which as one of the consequences is really making the middle class shrinking, therefore providing for the increased number of poor to be very populist in their attitude, including political attitudes. So I would be very worried of these results of the crisis. Then we are faced with a new challenge for the region, and this is the foreign fighters. It is not tens or hundreds, unfortunately, when it comes to this region, but more. Who've been engaged? Is it Syria? Is it ISIL recently, or Ukraine, elsewhere? So these people are leaving and coming back. Then they're working with the others in their communities. So it is a serious challenge. So this is why I would say that poverty is very relevant and is making room for radical attitude among the people. Therefore, and I think both Ambassador Kirby as well as the other Michael, Ambassador Davenport, have mentioned while approaching the issue of the relevance of both EU and NATO, to what extent there is a similarity in requirements when it comes to rule of law state. A country which is respecting freedom of media, a country which is decisively fighting organized crime, which is very much interconnected in the region, the country which is decisively fighting corruption. So these elements are the elements that a country, irrespective of the fact whether it is on a way towards the EU or both EU and NATO, will have to deal with. And these are the challenges which I think are the common in the region. You may say there are a few more percent left or right, but this is a reality we are living in. So I would say that there is an awareness in the region that while approaching the EU, meaning on their part through negotiations, through accession procedure, they are creating a decent country they will be living in, irrespective of the final outcome, whether they'll join in a year or in 10, 15. So this is a strong sentiment, I would say, shared in each and every country, that eventually it is going to be a rule of law state. Not necessarily rich, but at least the country they would like to live in years to come. This is why I was very happy to hear that there is a strong support, in spite of all odds, in spite of the crisis, for the EU, and in spite of some percents going down for the transatlantic partnership between the EU and the US. I would dare to say that, of course, there are differences if you go from one to another country in this region, but this would be a common denominator. These are the countries which appreciate transatlantic partnership. but are at the same time quite open towards realities they are living in times of crisis, meaning how relevant it is for each and every economy in the region to attract investors beyond the EU, beyond US. And there is a lot of room for the investors coming from either Arab countries, China, Russia. Just look around. This is reality we are living in. Governments are in despair when it comes to economic situation. And they need to provide to the people what they've been voted for. And this is, in one sentence, a better life. And they are looking around in times of crisis to find investors, while being very open for wherever the money is coming from. And then I'm pretty much confident that there should be no skepticism. People in this country, in Serbia, but also in the countries in the region, are aware that the EU membership will not necessarily resolve all the problems they have, including economic problems. They do not look at the EU as they did years back, as an economic paradise. They are aware of the problems, but they still insist that if they want to be much richer, they will for sure live in a rule of law state. And this is, they will continue supporting their own governments while looking around for the investors, and at the same time decisively continue towards the EU membership. So I'd like to stop here in order then to provide for all of those who've been patiently listening to us for 1 hour 45 minutes, so that we can really discuss all of these issues rather than delivering the statements. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, we are unfortunately behind the schedule, and without actually any further ado, I will open up for the question and answers session or part of the panel. So please raise your hand, and do also introduce yourselves when given the word.
Don't tell us we've answered all your questions.
Seems that everything is clear. Does anybody at the back, because I can't see through our journalists and reporters, is anyone raising? So Ozgur, our colleague from the Ankara GMF office.
My name is Özgür Ünlü Sacıklı, Director of Ankara Office of German Marshall Fund. My question goes to Ambassador Kirby. Ambassador Kirby, you have said that the path that follows first NATO membership and then EU membership is not a must anymore, and we could also have the other way around. On the other hand, what we see is that Russia has never invaded a NATO member, while they have invaded countries that are on their way to becoming NATO members. So what would NATO do if Russia decided to invade or, let's say, intimidate a country that's on its way to becoming an EU member along its borders?
It's sort of difficult for me to talk in a hypothetical, but I think certainly when you take a look at what my president has said, and remember NATO is a group of countries, not just the United States, so I would argue that it's not just up to the United States to respond, but certainly my president has made it clear for NATO members, we understand our commitments. We've made that crystal clear. I don't think it was an accident that my president was in Tallinn saying that. Not much after one of their people disappeared into Russia and was later arrested. We don't have, as NATO or the United States, a commitment, a treaty-binding commitment to countries that aren't members. So I think that that's a hypothetical. But yeah, so I'll leave it at that. I'm sorry if it was vague, but yeah. But you have another NATO ambassador here.
I think that's known as positive.
I'm here as president of the European Union.
But I mean, the point I was trying to make on NATO versus EU is, you know, look, we have strong members of the EU who aren't in NATO. I would note that Sweden, in terms of its response to the notion of what has been happening in Ukraine, is close to the Polish line. And I would note that they have been neutral for 200 years. And it's a different concept of neutrality than we have seen exercised in some other places. I would note that the EU can encompass neutral countries, Austria as well, and then NATO can have European members who are not EU, Turkey, for instance, but also Norway. But you know, a lot of the things are in common. But I would, you know, when I talk about the OSCE chairmanship, frankly, Switzerland, which has a slightly different concept of neutrality than does Sweden, has been the OSCE chair for the last year. And I would note that you can be neutral without feeling that that both parties in a dispute are equally wrong or equally right. And if there's a message that you're looking for me to pass locally in Serbia, Serbia's neutrality doesn't mean that it doesn't have to stand up for what it believes is right, and it should decide what is right, how neighbors act to neighbors. Serbia has a history of deciding when to stand up and complain about treatment. We have World War I and World War II as examples of Serbia standing up. It never said it was neutral, but you know, there are different models around. But in closing, I would say that both NATO and the EU are communities of democracies that stand for fundamental human rights, and that's important to this country as well, because I think my impression is that Serbians want to be a democracy, a functioning democracy, and with the respect for the rights and the human rights of their fellow citizens.
Gordana, if I may reflect on neutrality concepts, there are at least two possibilities how the neutrality might be understood. One would be we are neither with them nor with them. My guess would be that the concept you may expect from Serbia in a year to come while chairing the OSCE would be a different one. I believe Serbia will try to engage both one as well as the other side. So it might be a different concept of neutrality, the one which is engaging everybody, and I would hope for this kind of engagement in a year to come.
I would just like to say that I think it's important to remember that many of the countries which are members of NATO are also members of the European Union. And that for many countries that are in both NATO and the European Union, both of those international bodies have a hugely important part to play in their security. But it's also true to say that the countries of the European Union, such as Sweden, such as Ireland, such as Austria, which are not members of NATO, also see their relationship with NATO as very important to their security. And we're getting on here to a lot of the themes that Sonia has put before us for discussion in tomorrow's sessions. And I just say make one more point, which I think is that we shouldn't get into, if we or allow ourselves to be trapped by the idea that this is about just, you know, sort of two sides. I mean, I think it's important that, you know, we are not it is not our objective, I hope, to be sort of returning to or going forward to another sort of overall divide. Actually, the Russia and the relationship and managing the relationship with Russia, both for the EU, and for the countries, the member states of the EU, and for NATO, is going to be a huge and perhaps the biggest challenge in managing relationships with the countries in between.
Thank you, Ambassador Davenport. I guess different models of neutrality depend on different ways of having or being dependent or not dependent. Constanze, you wanted to comment on something?
Let me, I'd just like to pick up on a point that the survey makes somewhat obliquely, but that Goran picked up on, and that is that there is an intimate and I think crucial connection between whether a country is a decent society, a well-governed, decent society, and the kind of foreign and security policy it has. We've seen that in several ways in recent years. We've seen that in the course of the economic crisis. The reason why countries like Greece are more or less under complete EU budgetary authority is that the rest of Europe decided that the corruption and political dysfunctionality of a country like Greece was a risk to the rest of the EU. In other words, that it made the rest of the EU more vulnerable to the crisis, and that therefore it was important that Greece and other countries change the way they did business so as to be themselves less vulnerable and reduce the vulnerability of their neighbors. I think that holds a lesson for the Balkans. I think it also holds a lesson for our relations with Russia. In that, if you look at the Russia slide that I showed you, what Russian citizens are most concerned about, it is corruption and the state of their economy. Yeah. And I think that there is a relationship between that concern and the state of Russian foreign and security policy. I don't think I need to elaborate. But what that shows you is that we have an interest in each other's internal affairs in ways that we didn't have in the past. And that means that we are, and I think that's of concern also to what my colleague Gordana is doing here, that it matters also how we deal with civil societies, not just within Europe, but also between Europe and the Balkans, and also with Russian civil society. And I think it's important to listen to what they have to say, and perhaps not only to government diplomats, and without wanting to be rude to anybody on this panel.
Do we have any new questions, please?
We've talked people into asking questions. Very good.
Svetlana Đurđević-Lukić, Public Policy Research Center. I would like to thank the Balkan Trust for Democracy for Transatlantic Trends, which is a very important source of data for us to analyze every and each year. And although the countries in this region are not included, we more or less know some basic affiliation and preferences and ideas about support for this or that foreign policy. And specifically, I have in mind, for example, that the Albanians and the Bosniaks and in this region are very well known as the biggest supporter of the United States. So my question goes to the Ambassador Kirby. Do you expect that current situation with fighters leaving for Syria and Iraq from precisely those regions in this region might affect, to a certain extent, very strong relationship between the countries mentioned and the United States?
Well, I have to say that my country has been an exporter of foreign fighters to a variety of places for a number of years. That has been a concern. Al-Shabaab has a number of people who are Americans. We had a gentleman in Yemen who was an American who we killed using a drone. And we've had a number of our citizens in the Middle East being involved. So, you know, we have unfortunate experience with that. I would say, I know that the government of Serbia is quite concerned about the citizens from here going. And I would say that they're concerned about the citizens from here going both to Ukraine and to the Middle East. I think we should take a look at the foreign fighters going as an opportunity to bring some of the governments together in a way that's quite useful. Serbia is concerned. Many countries in Europe have problems. On the other side of the Mediterranean, Morocco has been concerned for years about that. Albania, Bosnia, Kosovo, Serbia, Macedonia, all have issues of various kinds. And it's an opportunity, one can look at it slightly differently, is to work together to see what can't be done together to counter the sorts of societal conditions that also lead to some of these primarily young men, but also some young women to go to places and risk their lives for radical causes. High youth unemployment, a feeling of alienation. Some of these things are common for all of the countries. Whether it's an ethnic Muslim or it's an ethnic Serb here, Orthodox, unemployment rate is way too high. And so, you know, when my colleague, Ambassador Manzo, was talking about the Italian presidency and providing economic growth in this region, that's key. And I think optimistically that's maybe not for all of the fighters, but there's some issues in there. But I look at it as an opportunity to bring the governments together and cooperate because it's a common issue that's going to require a common solution across the borders and I think a stronger economy.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I think the gentleman in the second row was first.
My name is Mirza Stelzenmüller and I'm MP in Federal Parliament in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So I'm interested how you see the future of the Western Balkans and how you see and how you think actually how the countries will go to the European Union and NATO. Is it with separately or together? Like we form a model which we already see with Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia and Hungary. And also, is there a connection between Western Balkans and the Ukraine issue? In Ukraine, is there a connection? Because some of the people say that maybe the solution and maybe the problem which we have in Western Balkans will resolve if we resolve also the Ukraine. And you can see also in Western Balkans that in last 10 or 15 years, you can see also the influence of Russian money, and you can see Gazprom, the banks, and everything else. Do you wait, and what actually we wait for Western Balkans to become the part of the European Union and NATO, and it could be faster, because if you really listen to people in Bosnia, in both entities, if you say like that, in Republika Srpska and Federation, there is a NATO conference before, I don't know, 6 months, and I see one of the interesting results that 70%, more than 70% of the people in both entities want to go and see the Bosnia in NATO and European Union. So we have different situations, what actually people want, what they think, and what politicians do in Bosnia. Thank you.
I mean, I think it's important, first of all, to stress that there is a strong political commitment from the European Union to enlargement, to include all the countries of this region, as I said before. Successive European councils have reiterated the attachment to that policy. And successive European councils have actually taken that policy forward in very concrete ways. And clearly we saw the enlargement to take in Croatia most recently, but also very significant steps for other countries in the region, especially Serbia, Montenegro, Albania, and also the SAA negotiation with Kosovo. I think that commitment is a strong one. I think that there was a lot of debate and there was a lot of speculation in the run-up to the formation of Team Juncker as to whether there would be a portfolio for enlargement. Well, there may be a slight rejigging of the name, and I know there's a lot of controversy over the interpretation of the timelines that Mr. Juncker set. But actually, I think everybody understands that there will not actually be able to be, because of the requirements of the enlargement process, there won't be another accession in the near future. But the fact that Mr. Hahn, who is doing his hearing today in the Parliament, in the European Parliament, will be the Commissioner for the enlargement negotiations, underlines that this is an active, proactive area of work for, and a priority area of work for an experienced Commissioner. Now, it's clear that when it comes to the point at which each of the countries in the region is, and the point which each of the countries in this region has reached is different. But then we come to where Serbia is, and Tanya's left, but I think that if we talk about leadership, as we have a lot during this discussion, Serbia has also a key leadership role, because other countries in this region, and I hesitate to talk about the what people think in Bosnia with Goran sitting there, but I think that Serbia moving forward on the path of EU integration and really making solid, concrete steps towards accession is probably one of the most important single things that can help to encourage reanimation of the EU agenda in other countries in the region, especially I'm thinking about Bosnia and Herzegovina. I don't know if maybe you were hinting at these ideas that have been circulating at times about a sort of a regatta approach to enlargement in the region. I mean, that is not the approach at the moment. I mean, the enlargement approach is of focusing in the early stages of accession and negotiation on the core and fundamental areas and values of the European Union. And I think actually that this survey has brought out very well the extent to which citizens attach importance precisely to those fundamental values and the rule of law, as providing the necessary framework without which the prosperity agenda cannot really be pursued. I think that what we will see, if you ask me to look to the future, I think what we will see, and I hope what we will see over the next period, in the next year, 2, 3 years, will be an incremental approach, a solid progress on this path, and I do agree with what Giuseppe said, that there are already Europe is already here in this region, and I think the European Union is going to become more present, and I think that Serbia also, as playing a lead role in this whole process in the region potentially, I think will also find that its voice is heard more in the rest of Europe, especially looking ahead to the challenge of the OSCE chairmanship next year, which is a tremendous opportunity for Serbia, and a tremendous opportunity for all of us, I think.
Ambassador Manzo.
If I can just add something and build on what Michael said about Europe being here, I think there's a misperception somehow here or in the Balkans about what means to, let's say, join Europe. And I think that's exactly where the leadership of Serbia comes handy when looking at the whole thing. It's not a process per se. It's not like we have to run to the ticket office to get the first ticket for the next bus that will take us to Brussels by 2020. That's not the goal. And this is why I think, as Michael was saying, the Belgrade's leadership in this is quite important, because it's showing that what Belgrade is doing is not running to Brussels like we want to get there with the regatta, but they are building Europe here by the very pride thing that we did, we witnessed on Sunday, by agreeing on Kosovo with the normalization with Pristina on the dialogue. This is exactly, I mean, it's not a given model. To get to Europe, you have to go to get there by this time. So next, let's say, step is that. It's about really joining Europe as a value, as a community of values, community of as we were saying, it's not the process per se. So if the question is what's coming next for Bosnia or for Albania or for others, it can be different answers to that, with different ways to reach the same goal, becoming part of Europe, of course with different process, but with the same goal and the same attitude, that is just sharing the values. So I think, for instance, and I'll stop there, but for instance, regional approach to the integration process, it's key. Italian presidency is pushing for the Adriatic-Ionic initiative, because it helps all the countries of the regions, regardless of who's ahead in the track and who's behind, to join and to go and to move forward all together. So I think we should actually rethink, I mean, you should rethink whether you are from Bosnia or Albania or Serbia, you should rethink the whole things as not being a process itself, like it's a goal just to join the group. It is to actually be part of the group.
Two brief points, and thank you very much for the patience. One, there was a question raised related to the foreign fighters and how different nations or ethnicities are engaged. I'd like to say that there is a lack of cooperation of security services in the region, unfortunately. But on the other hand, what I can say and what I can promise, thanks to the support of European Commission, we have put in place an internal mechanism of exchange of the classified data for the intelligence services in the region, and we believe in the RCC that this will help confront the challenge, because the challenge is really a challenge for the stability of the region as such. Second point, since we've discussed policies, and this is how we started this whole discussion, I'd like to say that I believe that it goes not only for the government of Serbia, but in particular for the government of Serbia, but also for the other governments which are in the accession process, that as accession process progress, we may expect even closer synchronization of the foreign policy on each and every country in the process with the EU foreign and security policies. Therefore, I would like to underline the relationship between Brussels and Washington, meaning the EU-US relationship, as one of the ways to have a synchronized attitude in a wider Europe, meaning not only the EU, but also in the accession countries. Therefore, it remains very important and relevant constant. But I hope that first step will be even greater synchronization of domestic, national, foreign and security policies with the EU policies, and then to closer relationship with Washington as well. Thank you.
Very much, Ambassador Svilanović. I'm afraid we'll have to stop here because we went so way over time. I am very grateful to our distinguished panelists for having found the time and for having had the patience and for being late for their next meetings, but to have endured here with us and answered all our questions. I thank you for your participation, and I'm hopeful that some of the questions that you have asked or you may have wanted to ask and didn't get a chance will be answered throughout the Belgrade Security Forum, and that we will enjoy the debates that are ahead of us in the coming 2 days. Thank you very much.